Now, I want to do something for you as we head into the end of the evening. Something special for you on this July 2nd, a Thursday, but a day where we get to continue what we were talking about last night, a little fiction. And I promised that I would read this story tonight. I said, tomorrow you'll hear this story. And so it's time for us to go with a little Outer Limits control voice and fiction time.
There is nothing wrong with your television set. Do not attempt to adjust the picture. We are controlling transmission. If we wish to make it louder, we will bring up the volume. If we wish to make it softer, we will tune it to a whisper. We will control the horizontal. We will control the vertical. We can roll the image, make it flutter. We can change the focus to a soft blur, or sharpen it to crystal clarity. For the next hour, sit quietly and we will control all that you see and hear. We repeat, there is nothing wrong with your television set. You are about to participate in a great adventure. You are about to experience the awe and mystery which reaches from the inner mind to the outer limits.
All right, Outer Limits time, everybody. It's time for a nice summer story. Imagine you're by the campfire. It's not super, super hot, but it's a nice, warm summer night. You got some marshmallows going. We're going to read a good story. The most famous story by W.C. Morrow, William Chambers, like Robert W. Chambers Morrow, born in 1853, died in 1923. And, of course, he was an American writer, noted mainly for his short stories. Now, we don't want to read too much on that screen. Because we're going to be reading his short story, The Unconquerable Enemy, tonight. Want to show you this if you want to pick up one of his collections, The Monster Maker and Other Stories. And we mentioned that William Morrow was highly admired by Ambrose Bierce. And they both worked on the West Coast, and Ambrose Bierce was able to get some of William Morrow's stuff published by the Hearst Publishing Company. Pretty cool stuff. Now, he came around at sort of the changeover from what you might call the penny dreadfuls and the serialized stories in newspapers that saw people like Alexander Dumas writing his stuff, Charles Dickens writing his stuff, in many cases Arthur Conan Doyle writing his short stories, or in some cases his novels that were serialized as well in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So we're going to read to you one of the stories that also represents something of the start of a movement that there were a number of movements, obviously, in thematic vibe or themes within writing that was popular at the time. You had the occultism coming up with seances, Madame Blavatsky, the Golden Dawn, and all those things, with Theosophy coming around in the 1920s and so on, early 1900s. Arthur Conan Doyle was fascinated by that stuff. He was friends with Houdini. Houdini was a skeptic, so they would have great conversations about that. But you had other things, too. You have the rise of theories of evolution and scientism, materialism rather than, Christianity necessarily. And I'm not saying that that Mr. Morrow was that, but these were some of the vibes. And then in publishing, we saw the penny dreadful thing sort of changing over into the pulp magazines. So you had penny dreadfuls. They're becoming a little bit more organized, sort of like, the way that punk zines were published by people on copying machines in various locations. And they, you had to do an order form to get a cassette from somebody, that sort of thing. Everything sort of grows, becomes more organized, and greater popularity, ease of distribution, and more people can read it. These writers become more popular. So a lot of different types of writing at the time. Great stuff from people like Jules Verne, people like Edgar Rice Burroughs, amazing adventure stories, great swashbuckling stories by people like Dumas, great suspense stories and mystery stories, Edgar Allan Poe, and so many of those others, right? So there's really this amazing blossoming coming around of literature and adventure literature, spy literature, detective fiction, horror fiction, which itself has a number of branches. And this is where Morrow picked up some strains and amplified on these strains, because Morrow wasn't, as we discussed last night in Wordsmith Wednesday, he wasn't necessarily a writer of the weird, and he wasn't necessarily a ghost story writer. Typically, the ghost stories of the time are really just sort of mysteries, like, oh, there's something spooky going on, and then the spirit reveals what really happened, and that's why there's a spirit there to try to set things right. And now we know the dark secret of that house, or whatever it is, you know, the Gothic sort of thing with the woman running away from the big castle, you know. That's the way all the Gothic covers used to be. So anyway, if we look at what Morrow did, Morrow was a writer who had a lot of visceral violence in his stories, and it wasn't necessarily supernatural violence. A lot of it was the danger a person could pose when confronting another person. So with that said, we're going to turn to this book, Horror Times 10. I'm going to keep myself small, and I want to do one thing, however, before I do anything else. And up on the screen, I'm going to do one thing real quick here and just make it that we've got a little something for you that will work well. And we're going to go with this. We're just going to say, okay. Okay, so this ought to do it. And we're going to keep this up on the screen right now. William Morrow. Okay, good stuff. All right, so let's go with the writing of William Morrow, and this is a story that was published at the turn of the last century. It is called His Unconquerable Enemy, and it is in this collection called Horror Times 10, edited by Alden H. Norton, Norton, if you're just listening in audio, and this was published in 1967. Originally, this is the fourth printing from 1969. Has stories by Ray Bradbury, Robert Bloch, H.P. Lovecraft. Never heard of them. Don't know any of those guys. Max Brand, by the way, the Western writer, has a story in here. Maybe we'll read that one sometime. That's a little bit longer than some of these other ones. The Unconquerable Enemy by W.C. Morrow. I was summoned from Calcutta to the heart of India to perform a difficult surgical operation on one of the women of the great Raja's household. I found the Raja a man of a noble character, but possessed, as I afterward discovered, of a sense of cruelty purely oriental, and in contrast to the indolence of his disposition. He was so grateful for the success that attended my mission that he urged me to remain a guest at the palace as long as it might please me to stay, and I thankfully accepted the invitation. One of the male servants attracted my notice for his marvelous capacity of malice. His name was Naranya, and I am certain that there must have been a large proportion of Malay blood in his veins, for, unlike the Indians, from whom he differed also in complexion, he was extremely alert, active, nervous, and sensitive. A redeeming circumstance was his love for his master. Once his violent temper led him to the commission of an atrocious crime, the fatal stabbing of a dwarf. In punishment for this, the Raja ordered that Naranya's right arm, the offending one, be severed from his body. The sentence was executed in a bungling fashion by a stupid fellow armed with an axe. And I, being a surgeon, was compelled, in order to save Naranya's life, to perform an amputation of the stump, leaving not a vestige of the limb remaining. After this, he developed an augmented fiendishness. His love for the Raja was changed to hate, and his mad anger he flung discretion to the winds. Driven once to frenzy by the Raja's scornful treatment, he sprang upon the Raja with a knife, but fortunately was seized and disarmed. To his unspeakable dismay, the Raja sentenced him for his offense to suffer amputation of the remaining arm. It was done as in the former instance. This had the effect of putting a temporary curb on Naranya's spirit, or rather, of changing the outward manifestations of his diabolism. Being armless, he was at first largely at the mercy of those who ministered to his needs, a duty which I undertook to see was properly discharged, for I felt an interest in this strangely distorted nature, this man of a distorted mind. His sense of helplessness, combined with a damnable scheme for revenge, which he had secretly formed, caused Naranya to change his fierce, impetuous, and unruly conduct into a smooth, quiet, insinuating bearing, which he carried so artfully as to deceive those with whom he was brought in contact, including the Raja himself. Naranya, being exceedingly quick, intelligent, and dexterous, and having an unconquerable will, turned his attention to the cultivating of an enlarged usefulness of his legs, feet, and toes, with so excellent effect that in time he was able to perform wonderful feats with those members. Thus, his capability, especially for destructive mischief, was considerably restored. One morning, the Raja's only son, a young man of an uncommonly amiable and noble disposition, was found dead in bed. His murder was a most atrocious one, his body being mutilated in a mocking manner. But in my eyes, the most significant of all the mutilations was the entire removal and disappearance of the young prince's arms. The death of the young man nearly brought the Raja to the grave. It was not, therefore, until I had nursed him back to health that I began a systematic inquiry into the matter. I said nothing of my own discoveries and conclusions until after the Raja and his officers had failed and my work had been done. Then I submitted to him a written report, making a close analysis of all the circumstances and closing by charging the name of Naranya. The Raja, convinced by my proof and argument, at once ordered Naranya to be put to death, this to be accomplished slowly and with frightful tortures. The sentence was so cruel and revolting that it filled me with horror, and I implored that the wretch be shot. Finally, through a sense of gratitude to me, the Raja relaxed. When Naranya was charged with the crime, he denied it, of course, but seeing that the Raja was convinced, he threw aside all restraint and, dancing, laughing, and shrieking in the most horrible manner, confessed his guilt, gloating over it, and reviling the Raja to his teeth. This, knowing that some fearful death awaited him. The Raja decided upon the details of the matter that night, and in the morning he informed me of his decision. It was that Naranya's life should be spared, but that both of his legs should be broken with hammers, and that then I should amputate the limbs at the trunk. Appended to this horrible sentence was a provision that the maimed wretch should be kept and tortured at regular intervals by such means as afterward might be devised. Sickened to the heart by the awful duty set out for me, I nevertheless performed it with success, and I care to say nothing more about that part of the tragedy. Naranya escaped death very narrowly, and was a long time in recovering his wanton vitality. During all these weeks, the Raja neither saw him nor made inquiries concerning him. But when, as in duty bound, I made official report that the man had recovered his strength, the Raja's eyes brightened, and he emerged with deadly activity from the stupor into which he so long had been plunged. The Raja's palace was a noble structure, but it is necessary here to describe only the grand hall. It was an immense chamber, with a floor of polished inlaid stone and a lofty arched ceiling. A soft light stole into it through stained glass set in the roof and at high windows on one side. In the middle of the room was a rich fountain, which threw up a tall, slender column of water, with smaller and shorter jets grouped around it. Across one end of the hall, halfway to the ceiling, was a balcony, which communicated with the upper story of a wing, and from which a flight of stone stairs descended to the floor of the hall. During the hot summers, this room was delightfully cool. It was the Raja's favorite lounging place, and when the nights were hot, he had his cot taken thither, and there he slept. This hall was chosen for Naranya's permanent prison. Here he was to stay so long as he might live, with never a glimpse of the shining world or the glorious heavens. To one of his nervous, disconnected nature, such confinement was worse than death. At the Raja's order, there was constructed for him a small pen of open ironwork, circular, and about 4 feet in diameter, elevated on 4 slender iron posts, 10 feet above the floor, and placed between the balcony and the fountain. Such was Naranya's prison. The pen was about 4 feet in depth, and the pen top was left open for the convenience of the servants, whose duty it should be to care for him. These precautions for his safe confinement were taken at my suggestion, for although the man was now deprived of all 4 of his limbs, I still feared that he might develop some extraordinary, unheard of power for mischief. It was provided that the attendants should reach his cage by means of a movable ladder. All these arrangements having been made and Naranya hoisted into his cage, the Raja emerged upon the balcony to see him for the first time since the last amputation. Naranya had been lying, panting and helpless, on the floor of his cage. But when his quick ear caught the sound of the Raja's footfall, he squirmed about until he had brought the back of his head against the railing. Elevating his eyes above his chest and enabled to peer through the open work of the cage, thus the 2 deadly enemies now faced each other. The Raja's stern face paled at sight of the hideous, shapeless thing which met his gaze, but he soon recovered, and the old, hard, cruel, sinister look returned. Naranya's black hair and beard had grown long, and they added to the natural ferocity of his aspect. His eyes blazed upon the Raja with a terrible light. His lips parted, and he gasped for breath. His face was ashen with rage and despair, and his thin, distended nostrils quivered. The Raja folded his arms and gazed down from the balcony upon the frightful wreck that he had made. Oh, the deathful pathos of that picture, the inhumanity of it, the deep and dismal tragedy of it. Who might look into the wild, despairing heart of the prisoner and see and understand the frightful turmoil there, the surging, choking passion, unbridled but impotent ferocity, frantic thirst for a vengeance that should be deeper than hell. Naranya gazed, his shapeless body heaving, his eyes aflame, and then, in a strong, clear voice, which rang throughout the great hall with rapid speech, he hurled at the Raja the most insulting defiance, the most awful curses. He cursed the womb that had conceived him, the food that should nourish him, the wealth that had brought him power, cursed him in the name of Buddha and all the wise men, cursed by the sun, the moon, and the stars, by the continents, mountains, oceans, and rivers, by all things living, cursed his head, his heart, his entrails, cursed in a whirlwind of unmentionable words, heaped unimaginable insults, and the accursed contumely upon him, calling him a knave, a beast, a fool, a liar, an infamous and unspeakable coward. Calumnies all. The Raja heard it without the movement of a muscle, without the slightest change of countenance. And when the poor wretch had exhausted his strength and fallen helpless and silent to the floor, the Raja, with a grin, a cold smile, turned and strode away. The days passed. The Raja, not deterred by Naranya's curses often heaped upon him, spent even more time than formerly in the great hall and slept there oftener at night. And finally Naranya wearied of cursing and defying him and fell into a sullen silence. The man was a study for me, and I observed every change in his fleeting moods. Generally, his condition was that of miserable despair, which he attempted bravely to conceal. Even the boon of suicide had been denied him, for when he would wriggle into an erect position, the rail of his pen was a foot above his head, so that he could not clamber over and break his skull on the stone floor beneath. And when he had tried to starve himself, the attendees forced food down his throat, so that he abandoned such attempts. At times his eyes would blaze, and his breath would come in gasps, for imaginary vengeance was working within him. But steadily he became quieter and more tractable, and was pleasant and responsive when I would converse with him. Whatever might have been the tortures which the Raja had decided on, none as yet had been ordered. And although Naranya knew that they were in contemplation over these, he never referred to them or complained of his lot or future. The awful climax of this situation was reached one night, and even after this lapse of years, I cannot approach its description without a shudder. It was a hot night, and the Raja had gone to sleep in the great hall, lying on a high cot placed on the main floor, just underneath the edge of the balcony. I had been unable to sleep in my own apartment, and so I had stolen into the great hall through the heavily curtained entrance at the end farthest from the balcony. As I entered, I heard a peculiar soft sound above the patter of the fountain. Naranya's cage was partly concealed from my view by the spraying water, but I suspected that the unusual sound came from him. Stealing a little to one side and crouching against the dark hangings of the wall, I could see him in the faint light which dimly illuminated the hall, and then I discovered that my surmise was correct. Naranya was quietly at work. Curious to learn more, and knowing that only mischief could have been inspiring him, I sank into a thick robe on the floor and watched him. To my great astonishment, Naranya was tearing off with his teeth the bag which served as his outer garment. He did it cautiously, casting sharp glances frequently at the Raja, who, sleeping soundly on his cot below, breathed heavily. After starting a strip with his teeth, Naranya, by the same means, would attach it to the railing of his cage and then wriggle away, much after the manner of a caterpillar's crawling, and this would cause the strip to be torn out of the full length of his garment. He repeated this operation with incredible patience and skill until his entire garment had been torn into strips. 2 or 3 of these he tied end to end with his teeth, lips, and tongue, tightening the knots by placing one end of the strip under his body and drawing the other taut with his body. In this way, he made a line of several feet long, one end of which he made fast to the rail with his mouth. It then began to dawn on me that he was going to make an insane attempt, impossible of achievement, without hands, feet, arms, or legs, to escape from his cage. For what purpose? The Raja was asleep in the hall. Wait, I caught my breath. The desperate, insane thirst for revenge, which could have unhinged so clear and firm a mind. Even though he should accomplish the impossible feat of climbing over the railing of his cage, that he might fall to the floor below, for how could he slide down the rope? He would be, in all probability, killed or stunned. And even if he should escape these dangers, it would be impossible for him to clamber upon the cot without rousing the Raja, and impossible even though the Raja were dead. Amazed at the man's daring, and convinced that his sufferings and brooding had destroyed his reason, nevertheless I watched him with breathless interest. With other strips tied together, he made a short swing across one side of his cage. He caught the long end in his teeth at a point not far from the rails. Then, wriggling with great effort in an upright position, he back-braced himself against the rail. He put his chin over the swing and worked toward one end. He tightened the grasp of his chin on the swing, and with tremendous exertion, working the lower end of his spine against the railing, he began gradually to ascend the side of his cage. The labor was so great that he was compelled to pause at intervals, and his breathing was hard and painful. And even while thus resting, he was in a position of terrible strain, and his pushing against the swing caused it to press hard against his windpipe and perhaps nearly strangle him. After amazing effort, he had elevated the lower end of his body until it protruded above the railing, the top of which was now across the lower end of his abdomen. Gradually, he worked his body over, going backward, until there was sufficient excess of weight on the other side of the rail, and then, with a quick lurch, he raised his head and shoulders and swung into a horizontal position on top of the rail. Of course, he would have fallen to the floor below had it not been for the line which he held in his teeth. With so great nicety, he had estimated the distance between his mouth and the point where the rope was fastened to the rail. He had tightened the line and checked as he reached the horizontal position on the rail. If anyone had told me beforehand that such a feat as I had just seen this man accomplish were possible, I would have thought him a fool. Naranya was now balanced on his stomach across the top of the rail, and he eased his position by bending his spine and hanging down on either side as much as possible. Having rested thus for some minutes, he began cautiously to slide off backward, slowly paying out the line through his teeth, finding almost a fatal difficulty in passing the knots. Now it was quite impossible that the line would have Now it is quite possible that the line would have escaped altogether from his teeth laterally when he would slightly relax his hold to let it slip, had it not been for a very ingenious plan to which he had resorted. This consisted in his having made a turn of the line around his neck before he attacked the wing, thus securing a threefold control of the line, one by his teeth, another by friction against his neck, and a third by his ability to compress it between his cheek and shoulder. It was quite evident now that the minutest details of a most elaborate plan had been carefully worked out by him before beginning the task, and that possibly weeks of difficult theoretical study had been consumed in the mental preparation. As I observed him, I was reminded of certain hitherto unaccountable things which he had been doing for some weeks past, going through certain hitherto inexplicable motions, undoubtedly for the purpose of training his muscles for the immeasurably arduous labor which he was now performing. A stupendous and seemingly impossible part of his task had been accomplished. Could he reach the floor in safety? Gradually he worked himself backward over the rail, in imminent danger of falling, but his nerve never wavered, and I could see a wonderful light in his eyes. With something of a lurch, his body fell against the outer side of the railing, to which he was hanging by his chin, the line still held firmly in his teeth. Slowly, he slipped his chin from the rail and then hung suspended by the line that was in his teeth. By almost imperceptible degrees, with infinite caution, he descended the line. And finally, his unwieldy body rolled upon the floor, safe and unhurt. What miracle would this superhuman monster next accomplish? I was quick and strong, and was ready and able to intercept any dangerous act, but not until danger appeared would I interfere with this extraordinary scene. I must confess to astonishment upon having observed that Naranya, instead of proceeding directly toward the sleeping Raja, took quite another direction. Then it was only escape, after all, that the wretch had contemplated, and not the murder of the Raja. But how could he escape? The only possible way to reach the outer air without great risk was by ascending the stairs to the balcony and leaving by the corridor which opened upon it, and thus fall into the hands of some British soldiers quartered thereabout, who might conceive the idea of hiding him, but surely it was impossible for Naranya to ascend that long flight of stairs itself. Nevertheless, he made directly for them. His method of progression this: he lay upon his back and with the lower end of his body toward the stairs, then bowed his spine upward, thus drawing his head and shoulders a little forward, straightening and then pushing the lower end of his body forward a space until equal to that through which he had drawn his head. Repeating this again and again each time while bending his spine, preventing his head from slipping by pressing it against the floor and using it. Like a worm, his progress was laborious and slow, but sensible. And finally he arrived at the foot of the stairs. It was manifest that this insane purpose was to ascend the stairs. The desire for freedom must have been strong within him. Wriggling to an upright position against the newel post, he looked up at the great height which he had to climb, and he sighed. But there was no dimming of the light in his eyes. How could he accomplish the impossible task? His solution of the problem was very simple, though it was daring and perilous all the same. While leaning against the newel post, he let himself fall diagonally upon the bottom step, where he lay partly hanging over, but safe on his side. Turning upon his back, he wriggled forward along the step to the rail and raised himself to an upright position against it, as he had against the newel post, and fell as before and landed on the second step. In this manner, with inconceivable labor, he accomplished the ascent of the entire flight of stairs. It being apparent to me that the Raja was not the object of Naranya's movements, the anxiety which I had felt on that account was now entirely dissipated. The things which already had been accomplished were entirely beyond the nimblest imagination. The sympathy which I had always felt for the wretched man was now greatly quickened, and as infinitesimally small as I knew his chances for escape to be, I nevertheless hoped that he would succeed. Any assistance from me, however, was out of the question, and it never should be known that I had witnessed the escape. Naranya was now upon the balcony, and I could dimly see him wriggling along toward the door which led out upon the balcony. Finally, he stopped and wriggled to an upright position against the wall, which had wide openings between the balusters. His back was toward me, but he slowly turned and faced me in the hall. At that great distance, I could not distinguish his features, but the slowness with which he had worked, even before he had fully accomplished the ascent of the stairs, was evidenced all too eloquently and shown his extreme exhaustion. Nothing but a most desperate resolution could have sustained him through this, but he had drawn upon the last remnant of his strength. He looked around the hall with a sweeping glance, and then down upon the Raja, who was sleeping immediately beneath him, over 20 feet below. He looked long and earnestly, sinking lower and lower and lower upon the rail. Suddenly, to my inconceivable astonishment and dismay, he toppled through and shot downward from his lofty height. I held my breath, expecting to see him crushed upon the stone floor beneath, but instead, he fell upon the Raja's breast, driving him through the cot to the floor. I sprang forward with a loud cry for help and was instantly at the scene of the catastrophe. With indescribable horror, I saw that Naranya's teeth were buried in the Raja's throat. I tore the wretch away, but the blood was pouring from the Raja's arteries. His chest was crushed in, and he was gasping in the agony of death. People came running in, terrified. I turned to Naranya. He lay upon his back, his face hideously smeared with blood. Murder, and not escape, had been his intention from the beginning, and he had employed the only method by which there was ever a possibility of accomplishing it. I knelt beside him and saw that he, too, was dying. His back had been broken by the fall. He smiled sweetly into my face, and a triumphant look of accomplished revenge sat upon his face, even in death. And that is William Morrow's story, His Unconquerable Enemy, in the book Horror Times 10. What do you think? Was that good? I enjoyed that. It's quite a long, arduous description, but definitely gets you into it, and very disturbing thinking about that hobbled body and those stumps and the disfigurement. That must have been shocking for a lot of people at that time. Around 1906 or so, maybe even earlier than that. Yikes. Pretty scary. You might need some Crown Royal after that, although I don't drink it. What did you think of the William Morrow story from the early 1900s? His Unconquerable Enemy. Very cool. Let me see when this was first published for you. I think it's in here. Skeleton in the Closet. Yeah, I'll have to find out. Let me see if I can look it up, because it's not actually listed in here with the other stories. They have the other story publication dates. Robert Bloch's got one from 1943. Max Brand, 1919. Robert E. Howard, 1936. August Derleth, 1947. Lovecraft, 1928. But I don't see anything here. This is a Berkeley Medallion publication. Let me see if I can find out when that was published. In perhaps the pulps, maybe? Early pulps? Let me see. Let me see if I can find out. So we go publication date is Unconquerable. Okay, let's see. Wow. Check this out. March 1889. Holy smoke. 1889. Well, I suppose coming after the Civil War, people must have seen a lot of horrors, terrible things that must have happened to those who survived too, right? So I guess it's difficult to really assess how shocking this might have been to people, but this was not something that you typically would see in fiction. Poe, you got some Poe stuff. Obviously, Telltale Heart, he dismembers the body in Telltale Heart. But, as far as my research goes, I've never seen anything, that grisly from 1889. Man, that's intense. Wow. His Unconquerable Enemy. Whew. Well, let me know what you thought of that, everybody. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. See what you think. And by the way, I saw earlier in the chat, people were talking about Andrei Martyanov. I love his work. He's a really interesting guy. Andrei's great. And his YouTube stuff is terrific. Birdhouse wants to know, when is Tom Monteleone coming back on to read us a story? I will let him know you said that, man. I'll let him know. We've been in touch once in a while. He's been super, super busy. And on Wednesdays, he has a gathering. So, I wanted him to come on Wordsmith Wednesdays, but he has a charitable group that he gathers with, an Italian charitable group. And he was telling me they had a golf tournament last weekend, weekend before last. And he says they've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars with this group of people who play golf. Very, very cool. It's amazing. Yeah, he's awesome. He's so great. His writing is so, he had a blurb on something that I wrote where he talked about how my writing was as sharp as my sense of humor or something like that. And Tom is he's really, man, he's the template for that. He and F. Paul, great stuff. Man, awesome stuff. And again, generationally, they were heavily influenced by a lot of the pulp writers when they were kids. And then those pulp writers were heavily influenced by a lot of the serialized writers, like these guys, Dickens, Burroughs, Dumas, and those folks, right? So there's this sort of interesting lineage that got an injection from television and radio when those new mediums came around, and that really helped spread interest in these stories and made it even more prevalent than just the printing press, where people could absorb these stories in so many new ways, right? I mean, you didn't even have to have a light. You could just listen to a radio story, Interesting. I wonder if any of you from Canada and some of you from the United States might remember the CBC Canadian radio broadcasting show Nightfall that was on in the 80s. And it was rebroadcast on a lot of public radio stations and a few other private radio stations. Nightfall, careful of the edge. They had some really good ones. Some of them were cheesy, but some of them were really, really good. And most of them are available now. Like I actually downloaded almost all of them. I had them on a hard drive, which the hard drive got damaged, but I'm hoping to recover some of the data. But you can find a lot of them out there for download. I think some of them might even be in the Internet Archive now. And those are great. Those are a lot of fun. The old Shadow stories, those were fantastic. Really enjoyed those things. Some of the old Westerns are great. And don't forget, they had a whole series of sort of detective stories about a guy who worked for an insurance company. It was a Johnny Dollar. Johnny Dollar was the guy. And it was a great way to show private investigation done not through government, not through the police, but through private detection hired for insurance companies because they think they're getting defrauded, or they want to look in to see if something's authentic or something. Very, very cool stuff. Good stuff. They should bring that back. That'd be fun. It's like the TV show that I was working on with my friend Bobby out in LA. It was going to be called Stateless. And it was about a guy in the future where America is basically bankrupt and falling apart. A very wealthy man named Hazlitt, named after Henry Hazlitt, opens up a private city, essentially, sort of like the size of half of Rhode Island. And it's purely voluntarist. And it's sort of based on the Conklin concepts of things. And in order to go there, you have to have a sponsor, or you have to have enough money that you can put a certain amount down as a way to indemnify yourself. If you screw something up, then they'll be able to take this money. And he becomes a guy who heads up their sort of private police there. And it was cool. It was a really good idea. We got it around to like a couple networks, but nobody ever bid on it, which would have been really, really cool. I have another idea for a series. I want to talk to a couple buddies of mine once I get the chance to do it. So, but anyway, I better get going. We'll see you tomorrow night for Fiction Friday. It's been a terrific Wednesday. And again, thank you for the contributions, Jason. Terrific. Thank you so much. And Harry, again, I don't know if you're still in the house, Harry, if you got to see my thank you earlier. But that was incredibly nice of you yesterday, just as we were finishing the show. A $50 contribution. How cool is that, right? And so again, everybody, thank you so much. And if you want to see this show expand, please feel free to contribute. You can do so at Rumble. You can do so by subscribing to the Substack, the Gardner Goldsmith Substack. And, once I get the opportunity where I'm not constantly on the treadmill doing the news coverage and everything, we can start doing some daytime stuff, the midday mind melts. And those are going to be great. Those will be interviews, midday mind melts. I talked to the Russians about the title. So that'll be good. And then you can suggest people. We'll have occasions where we'll have multiple people on just to chat and stuff like that on the Mind Melts, which will be great. So I'm going to hit the road. I'm going to get some dinner. Stay cool out there, as Flip Wilson would say. And yeah, we'll see what happens with the warfare stuff. Thanks for being kindred spirits, you guys. It's a very interesting scene to... there aren't a lot of people like us. And I think that, as you probably can tell, I am unique amongst a certain group of people. You're probably unique for certain things. And when we get together, it's very comforting. I really, really enjoy it.